In times of national crisis, the media assume a crucial role, serving as a lifeline for its citizens by providing timely and accurate information and responding appropriately to the challenges at hand. Such was the case with the Caribbean Broadcasting Corporation in Barbados during the crisis in the Spice Isle. As resilience echoes through the ages, Grenada stands as a testament to the enduring spirit of its people.
Grenadians will never forget the events of October 19, 1983, the day when Maurice Bishop, Prime Minister and leader of the New Juril movement, together with colleagues Jacqueline Kreft, Eunice Whiteman, Evelyn Bullen, Evelyn Maitland, Keith Healing, Norris Bain, and Fitzroy Bain, were lined up against a wall at Fort Rupert St. George's by members of the People's Revolutionary Army and shot in cold blood.
This is program number 15 in the current series of Resilience of the Spice Isle. I'm Sherwood McCaskey. As always, I'm pleased that you have joined us. Our last episode ended with the assassination of Prime Minister Maurice Bishop and others on Fort Rupert, marking October the 19th, 1983 as a day shrouded in uncertainty. Newsrooms across the region buzz with activity as they diligently work to verify the reports streaming in from Grenada. In the true spirit of journalism, they sought to respond appropriately through their programming. Notably, the Caribbean Broadcasting Corporation here in Barbados garnered praise for its swift and insightful coverage of the unfolding events. In this episode, we rewind to a pivotal moment in news broadcasting, focusing on a news and current affairs program hosted by the esteemed broadcast journalist Sandra Baptiste.
Leslie, what about the role of the commander of the armed forces, Hudson Austin? Where do you think his loyalties lie? He had been out of circulation for about 72 hours since Friday, and then all of a sudden he went on radio with a very lengthy statement accusing Bishop of going against the wishes of the party.
It's a very strange speech, and frankly, I do not think it's Hudson Austin in its entirety. Hudson has a history of friendliness and brotherliness towards Maurice Bishop. They suffered together, they were in the cells beaten together. Now, what is significant in that speech is, one, the radio station referred to Hudson Austin as a member of the Central Bureau. They never referred to him as in his rank as General of the Army. They never referred to him in his civilian capacity as Minister of Communications and Works. Now, these are two far superior positions than the position on the Central Committee, because from the Central Committee you get promoted to the Bureau, which are the only organization capable of promoting you to cabinet rank. And at cabinet rank you get the promotion to general. So he was not described in his capacity as that. And remember too that Austin disappeared from about 10 o'clock on Friday night until this very lengthy speech by him, which was couched in words, that is indicative to me that this was not what Hudson wanted to say, that he did not volunteer all of this. And I doubt, he's not a long-winded chap. I doubt whether Hudson could have sat down and drafted that statement. I doubt very much so. And I want to think that it is the code faction in the Central Committee who wrote this and dictated that Austin should say so, because his was a voice of authority, a voice that was pro-Maurice Bishop and hoping to soften the situation so that later statements could come, well, look here, you heard from Austin himself that Maurice was misbehaving and we really have to get rid of him. I think this is a pattern that most countries with that sort of ideology usually put forward before taking some other positive action.
Leslie, there have been a lot of conflicting reports coming out of Grenada, and particularly there is uncertainty about the future of Maurice Bishop. Could you give us an assessment of how you feel for his safety at this time?
With the passage of time, Jerry, I'm becoming more apprehensive about the safety of Morris Bishop. Now, when the situation first broke on Friday, one would expect that if a hardline corps had usurped power or there was a counter coup, that they would dismiss Bishop immediately, and that sort of thing can be covered by any release, either shot while there was a counter-revolution and they regret the loss of life and that sort of thing. But the delay now, I want to think, would embarrass whoever is in command of the situation at the moment. Although it is not unheard of that even after long days of delay, the news could come out that he is dead. What is a fact is that he has lost control of the government. He's not in effective control, and his secondary title of Commander-in-Chief is useless to him, which means that those in the army loyal to him are not being mobilized or incapable of mobilizing themselves to, shall we say, come to his rescue.
But Leslie, that brings me to the question of who is really in control of the country. We've been getting the impression here in Barbados, certainly from Radio Free Grenada, that the Central Committee of the New Jewel Movement is in charge. Only a few minutes ago, I spoke to the Foreign Minister, Unison Whiteman, via telephone, and he says clearly that Cord is in charge and that he and 3 other cabinet ministers are resigning. What's your impression of who's in charge of the country?
Well, first of all, it must be clear to all of us that cabinet is not functioning. We know that Jacqueline Kreft, the Minister of Education, is under house arrest. We know that Radix, the Minister of Justice, has been detained. We've heard no word from the Minister of Information, Selwyn Strawn, and Unison Whiteman, as you've just said, on the line from Grenada coming up, that there's confusion there and that he's about to resign. The effective control based on the speech given by Hudson Austin and relayed by RFG so many times, which CBC carried, of course, to listeners and viewers, was indicative of something, indicative that the Central Committee is in charge. Now, the NGM situation is as this. There is the Central Committee, then there is the NJM Bureau, and then there is Cabinet. Now, Bernard Cord commands a majority in the Central Committee. Central Committee made up of the junior leadership, junior officers in the army, junior people in the national youth movements and the pioneer movements and so on, excepting in the militia, where Morris has the greater sympathy, so that Cord can command respect at the Central Committee stage, but Morris has always been notoriously in command of the cabinet stage of it. And it appears now that Bernard Cord has recruited sufficient strength among the junior officer corps to neutralize the older revolutionary army types. Either they may be in prison or they may be so neutralized that they cannot act on behalf of the Morris Bishop faction, so that Cord can strengthen his position at Central Committee, but I'm quite sure will be unable to recruit support at cabinet level other than that which he probably has at the moment.
It's obvious, Leslie, that there has been a rift between Cord and Bishop for some time. What would you say brought this to a head at this particular time?
Yes, there's always been a gap fixed between Cord and Morris Bishop because of the intensity of the ideology. Bernard Cord has never refused to accept the fact that he's an ultra-Leninist. In fact, he seems very happy when you describe him as such. Morris Bishop, on the other hand, always fought. He strove to allow himself to be seen and expose himself as a moderate, even if he had radical plans in mind to shift away from what we call a Westminster type of democracy. But he's never indicated that he wanted to dispense with it in its entirety, unlike Bernard Cord, who was always willing and continues to make speeches indicative that he intends to throw overboard any sort of Westminster pattern, any sort of election of the kind. And that was one of the base. Second, Morris Bishop was rather more lenient to the people who had to be detained after the revolution, acknowledging that you had to detain some. Bernard Cord was more intent on swifter action, even if that action or those actions might appear to be violent. He was not as calm in the situation as Morris Bishop has always been, and I think there a rift began. Secondly, you must have observed that there's been a softening in the attitude of Maurice Bishop towards his other CARICOM colleagues. And in fact, significant was his meeting with the Assistant Secretary of State in the United States in July. What went on there, we never knew. We never got a complete final communique. But political observers, and I myself have observed, Maurice Bishop coming back into the fold. You might wish to say coming out of the cold. He was doing things and saying things to assure his colleagues in CARICOM, look here, I'm sorry I had to break my promise. I couldn't hold the election sooner, but I'm going to do this. Another area of contention was the elections themselves, the appointment of the commission to draft the Constitution. Great differences between Bernard Coad and Maurice Bishop, even in terms of the personnel for that committee, headed by Alexander and the other chaps like Hart, the Grenada Attorney General, and Maurice wanted to get popular support on that, where Maurice is strong. The masses, the trade union people still respect him because they still believe that in good time, a bishop would have been able to take them, well, not backward, as they don't want to say, but towards the path that could lead to peace and understanding and better neighborliness with their neighbors and the sort of pattern of government that they were used to. So that's another area in which there was definitely a rift between Bernard and Maurice.
One factor that has to be taken into consideration is the wider Caribbean community. How would you see the other people in CARICOM, for instance, reacting if there were a change at the head of government in Grenada?
Well, Jerry, remember the original de facto recognition. First of all, I think CARICOM waited a wee while on London. London's famous words were, there has been no change in the Governor General, and therefore no change in our behavior towards Grenada. All right? And then came the CARICOM de facto recognition. They had quite a discussion on this before it came out. And that de facto was, in fact, for Maurice Bishop on the firm promises of elections and a return to normalcy as soon as possible. None of the present heads of government, I wouldn't like to speak for them, but I cannot see them sitting down with Bernard Coad. I mean, most emphatically, Leicester Board, it was very hard. Henry D.B. Ford had to work very hard here in Barbados to get Leicester and the St. Lucia and St. Vincent delegates to even agree to a de facto. And they've been pressing Maurice with this recently, and Maurice, I want to think, and I'm quite sure, was on the path towards regularizing the situation to have completely de facto, de jure recognition of the establishment, to get the elections off and to come back. But I do not see CARICOM, and it could mean the disruption of CARICOM. And even in the organization of East Caribbean states, I would not put it past the majority to refuse to accept the membership of Grenada under the leadership of Bernard Coad. And the other danger there, again, is how the people of Grenada will accept Bernard Coad if he is to be catapulted into the forefront as the Prime Minister. And there again, the apprehension of, if ever there is to be bloodshed, it will be precipitated by any forceful removal of Maurice Bishop and projection of Bernard Coad into prominence in Grenada. It will not be accepted by private sector people. And there's another group that you must always bear in mind who are in the wings, lying doggo since the 13th of March, and that great body of Grenadians who sincerely believed in Eric Gary. Whether we think of him as political vagabond or bandit, it doesn't matter. He's out of the show now. But even Maurice has not been able to recruit them, although he has been speaking with them recently and trying to show them, well, look, if you work together with us, and we can get these things and the democratic process coming back sooner. And I want to think that Bernard Coad would not have liked that at all.
And that was not to be. Barbadian Prime Minister Tom Adams demonstrated remarkable responsiveness to the situation, recognizing the pivotal role that the media houses play during crisis. He leveraged every opportunity and ensured that the public remained informed. This commitment was also extended to the people of Grenada and the Eastern Caribbean through the services of the Caribbean Broadcasting Corporation in Barbados, which became the vital voice for the Grenadian people.
Some disturbance in the Eastern Caribbean could safely be predicted after the Grenada coup of March 1979. A constitutional government was overthrown by force, an unprecedented event in our islands. And a new regime, having been recognized on the basis that elections would be held to legitimize it, did not hold such elections. Instead, Grenada moved in a direction that introduced great power confrontation into the Eastern Caribbean. When, after 3 or 4 years, the regime of Maurice Bishop, in the words of the New York Times, began to drift towards moderation, this aroused ideological passions in the bosom of his party, passions which soon consumed Bishop and party alike. The timetable of the resulting explosion, from Barbados's point of view, is easy to reconstruct. On Friday, October the 14th, our foreign ministry was informed by a friendly diplomatic source, not the United States, that following ideological disagreement, Maurice Bishop had been placed under house arrest and that Bernard Cord would be taking over as Prime Minister. This was apparently announced that day in St. George's, but was very badly received by the Grenadian people. I considered that house arrest of a Prime Minister was an act so extreme as to imply some measure of imminent violence and disorder. And when that afternoon I was notified that Unison Whiteman, Grenada's foreign minister, was in Barbados in transit to Grenada, I made arrangements to speak to him on the telephone.
The evening that Bishop had been arrested, I was in my office. For the first time, I didn't have any engagements for the evening because in that job I did, used to go to a lot of evening parties with the embassies and whatever. I said, well, this evening I can really relax and things. And then the phone rang and it was Pat Hughes. She was the special facilities officer, what we call in the VIP room. And she said Unison Whiteman, who was by then Minister of Foreign Affairs, had just come in from the United States. Are you aware that Mr. Bishop has been arrested, the Prime Minister? I said, no. I said, okay, I'll come down. I went downstairs. And there was Unison Whiteman, looking very calm. So I told him, well, I understand that your Prime Minister was arrested. He appeared that he had some knowledge of it, because he had left New York and came in. His attitude, you know, you expect him to be like that, but he seemed to have had some knowledge. So I said, it's strange, this looks like trouble. And the Prime Minister, Mr. Adams, he seemed to be a magnet for trouble. During his entire career, he had all types of problems. I don't know if Barbadians realize that, but he faced the most serious problems of any Prime Minister that I know. Anyway, so I went into the little private room. I went and I called Mr. Adams. As soon as my voice got there, Shirley King, his secretary, and as soon as she heard my voice, she knows, oh boy. And she put the call right through. He wasn't here at the time. So I told him what was happening and asked him if he'd like to speak to Mr. Whiteman. He said yes. So he spoke to Mr. Whiteman for about 20 minutes or so.
I suggested to him that it might not be safe to return home and that he would be welcome to stay in Barbados, indeed to have political asylum if he so wished. We spoke cordially, but he declined my offer and returned home that afternoon.
And then when Whiteman came up, he said, oh, the Prime Minister would like to speak to you. So I went in, I spoke to him. He said, Mr. Canada, I'm trying to stop him from going to Grenada because with this situation here, it's not safe. So I said, well, I can do some things to see if we can stop him. He said, but do whatever you can. So I decided to go over to Winslow Lewis, at the time acting as manager in charge of Leah. Winslow said, well, you know what, we can cancel his booking, at least to delay him here by some time. So that was agreed. I went back and told him, and he turned to Pat Hughes and said, look, Miss Hughes, you can charter a plane for me, is any aircraft for charter? So she said yes, so she didn't know what was going on. So she started to make the booking and so on. I went back to Mr. Adams. I said, you know, this is what he's doing now. So there was a long pause. I thought I was an awful line. There was a long, long pause. And then he said, Mr. Candler, I can't help him anymore. I tried my best to stop him. So if he wants to go, so I went back to Lewis, and we organized the passage for him, and he went back down there to make mischief a few days later.
A further day of confusion in Grenada followed, while some of us discussed the situation. I concluded that whatever our differences in the past, Mr. Bishop deserved the support of Caribbean governments in the present circumstances, and sought opinion on whether he could be got out of the hands of his enemies and the situation given an opportunity to stabilize. On this day also, Saturday, October the 15th, an official of the Ministry of Defense and Security reported to me that he had been tentatively approached by a United States official about the prospect of rescuing Maurice Bishop from his captors and had been made an offer of transport. This raised a number of questions. Would the regime perhaps allow Bishop to leave and go into exile? If not, would Bishop wish to be rescued? There were many other political prisoners in Grenada, put there by Bishop's government. It would clearly not have been right to attempt to save Bishop, but to ignore the detainees, some of whom had spent more than 4 years behind bars. This was a point put especially strongly by Prime Minister Cato of St. Vincent and the Grenadines when I approached him about the matter as one of the heads of government of the member countries of our regional security pact. I spoke also to other pact members and to officials of 2 friendly non-Caribbean countries, and took the advice of Colonel, now Brigadier Lewis, the regional security coordinator. Talks about a possible rescue were commenced and continued. Further days of confusion followed in Grenada. There were marches, arrests and detentions, and then on Tuesday, October the 18th, Unison Whiteman gave a telephone interview to the media in Barbados, indicating his support for Mr. Bishop's restoration to office as Prime Minister. Some of us in government discussed the matter, and some considered that Mr. Bishop would return to power and all would be well. I feared that Mr. Whiteman had signed his own death warrant, and so it eventually proved. But before that, an emergency meeting of the Barbados Cabinet was held on Wednesday, October the 19th, to consider what steps should be taken to deal with the obviously deteriorating situation. It was agreed to proceed with a rescue plan in collaboration with Eastern Caribbean countries and larger non-Caribbean countries with the resources necessary to carry out such an intricate operation. As we all now know, this proved to be in vain. While we were sitting in cabinet, the crowd rescued Bishop and led him unwittingly to his brutal death at the hands of his political opponents.
Gentlemen, what was your initial reaction to the news just after 10 o'clock yesterday evening? Perhaps, Pat, we can begin with you.
Well, the fact that the assassination of the NGN leadership of Maurice Bishop and ministers supportive of him and other members of the party came as no surprise to me at all, does not in any way diminish from the profound sense of shock and grief that I felt when I heard the news last night. It was really I was really flabbergasted at hearing that the event had actually taken place, although there were many reasons to believe from long ago and from certainly during the course of the week of crisis that this was going to be the way that the Code faction of the NGM would choose to eliminate the problem that was said to be faced in the party. It is very ironic, I felt on reflection after attempting to absorb the news, that the amount of blood that was shed, say, in the overthrow of the Gary regime was far less than in the case of overthrowing a regime between one faction of the party and another. In the case of 1979, in fact, none of the leaders of the Labour Party were assassinated, but it is certainly one of the greatest ironies that it was within the NGM itself, a party that had spent a long time campaigning against violence and bloodshed in Grenada, that one sees the most despicable acts of violence and bloodshed that I think the history of the country has ever seen, at least in its modern history in the 20th century. I cannot recall an incident. Even in the 1951 disturbances, when the working class movement was born in the country and 3 or 4 people were shot and killed by troops, even then one cannot recall a single set of incidents within a day in which there has been anything as despicable, as horrendous as what has happened in Grenada yesterday, and what might continue to happen unless certain firm measures are taken in the next couple of days. The Lord forbids that it does, but I'm in no position, we are in no position, I think, yet to say that we have seen the end of these monstrosities.
Well, like Pat, at the level of my head, I was sure that that's the way it was going to go, because this kind of operation is something of a one-way street. And so I was not surprised. And yet, my heart told me something else. I just couldn't believe it. I was sort of numbed and in great grief. The source of grief is increased because, again, I think I hear Pat saying something that I believe. It is that that we may not be seeing the end of it, because if the way that this kind of thing goes leads to some kind of elimination of the problem, all the problematic elements are not yet out of the way. And I really do hope that wise counsel prevails somewhere along the line for persons to recognize that this kind of carnage cannot be justified by any means whatever.
Having been killed, their bodies were moved, brought to Calavini, placed into graves, and old tires were put on top of it, and they were burnt. That's how it was disposed of. What happens to the bodies after that is another question mark, right? But that much we know.
There's one Jamaican military man that reported that after he saw when the Americans dug up the bodies. Okay, now we would have to go and corroborate all this way. There's still got a lot of research and that will go on around this thing to really have definitive positions on it. That's why for a long time, a lot of us didn't want to talk to it because we didn't have enough data. This Jamaican military man says that he could still recognize Morris Bishop's body, even though it was burnt. And of course, it had been riddled and ripped up by the bullets. But you could still recognize him. So the Americans could recognize him. And the Americans probably have the body just like that. When they kill someone, you take them through the whole body, you see? They probably got his hands, they might even have his head. A lot worse somewhere in America. But anybody that ever challenged ultimately to say, well, you know, I didn't kill the man, I say, come here, let me show you something. Look. You see that head there? Who do I look like? Do the fingerprint. Do the DNA. You can't get past that in terms of evidence. So sometimes they can dispose of the whole body. So I suspect that they have the critical bodies up there. If they don't have all that, they certainly have, certainly everything that will have Morris Bishop and some of the others, okay? So the families can continue, but you know, everybody would be very upset, I think, even to be talking about it. As I said, for a long time, nobody didn't want to talk about these things because it really hurt the people on the left. They were thrown into this terrible crisis.
But I know he's really dead, but it's even harder to face up because, you know, we weren't able to bury him, so there's no grave or anything that you can say, or you can put some flowers or anything. So I think that makes it even harder to really believe that it's happened, you know.
Unfortunately, it happened in Grenada on the afternoon of Wednesday, October the 19th, 1983. I'm Sherwood McCaskey. This has been episode 15 of Resilience of the Spice Isle. The series continues next week at the same time.